I would like to call the school board meeting for Tuesday, May 2nd, 2023 for the Des Moines Public Schools to order. Ms. Rios, would you please take the roll?
Yes. Ms. Alonso Diaz? Ms. Bradley?
Here.
Ms. Caldwell Johnson? Ms. Knox?
Here.
Ms. Martorano?
Here.
Ms. Norris?
Here.
Ms. Sawyer?
Here.
We have quorum.
Thank you. The first item of business is approval of the agenda. May I have a motion and second to approve the agenda?
Norris, motion to approve. Sawyer, second.
We have a motion by Norris and a second by Sawyer. Board members, please cast your votes. The vote is approved. Jackie? do you- The vote is approved, 5-0. Next on the agenda is the public forum, followed by the consent and regular agenda. We provide speakers at the forum an opportunity to address the board for up to 3 minutes regarding items that are not on the board agenda. We also allow any person the opportunity to speak to the board for up to 5 minutes following the presentation of an agenda item. If anyone wishes to speak during any portion of the business meeting, please email rosa.rios@dmschools.org. The same speaking protocols apply to all individuals who wish to address the board. Speakers will be called individually, and we ask that they state their name and address prior to providing comments. Students and minors do not have to provide their addresses. Guests of the board are encouraged to speak to matters relating to the program, services, and operations of DMPS. Please remember that Iowa law prohibits us from discussing specific employees or their job performance. We ask all speakers to avoid references to personalities or character attacks, as those types of comments do not contribute to the purpose for which this public forum exists. The use of inappropriate language will not be tolerated, and individuals choosing to do so will be gavelled out of order and asked to excuse themselves from the premises or escorted out by district security. As a reminder to the public and the board will not engage in a discussion with the public forum speakers, as it is our obligation to discuss only matters posted in the public agenda for the sake of transparency and opportunity afforded to all community stakeholders. Matters requiring attention will receive appropriate staff and/or board follow-up at the time after the meeting. Thanks for your participation. We appreciate your feedback and input. Ms. Rios, do we have any speakers for the public forum?
No speakers tonight.
Thank you. The next item on our agenda is C1 Monitoring Report Goal 2. Tonight, Board Member Bradley will be facilitating our board discussion of the monitoring report. Ms. Bradley, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you and good evening. As a board, it's our responsibility to listen to community voices, set a vision, monitor the district's progress towards achieving that vision, and make investments that support the vision. To monitor progress, the board will spend time during board meetings reviewing data specific to the goals and the guardrails. Progress monitoring is an opportunity for the board to ask questions to help us understand whether there is alignment between our vision, our goals, and our reality, current student performance, and growth. We analyze data by student groups and ask specific questions to help us better understand the needs of our students. One of the things that we do as a board before we even bring this conversation to the table is we ask 4 questions. One being, does it clearly show which specific goal our interim goal is being monitored? If you're following along with us, you will see that is already displayed on page 1. Does it clearly show the previous 3 reporting periods? And you'll see that also on page 1. And then does it clearly show the superintendent's understanding of the system, performance? Does it clearly show the superintendent's understanding of system performance relative to the goal? And you will see that also on page 1. And does it clearly show supporting documentation that evidences the superintendent's understanding of the system, if we're on track, if we're off track? That also is displayed there on page 1. Once we have said yes to that, we bring that to our board table, and what you will hear this evening is board members asking questions to understand what is working and where there are gaps. Some specific types of questions you will hear us asking will include who is struggling, what gaps exist between student groups, What do we need to know about what is currently happening? Why is it working in one area but not the other? How do we plan to support a specific student population? How do we know our strategies are working? And how might change show up in a future budget to support our strategies that are working? To help everyone follow along, I'm asking you all this evening to please indicate the page number and the progress measure that you are referencing. And for our conversation today, we will be having a conversation on interim goal 2C, the percent of favorable responses from grade 3 Black male students on self-efficacy measures of the Panorama Student SEL Survey will increase from 59% in June 2022 to 70% in June 2026, which will help us reach our overall goal. As a facilitator, I will ensure we have a clear understanding of the superintendent's evaluation of our progress to capture key action steps that the superintendent will implement to progress toward goal, capture information on specific actions coming in the future, identify any follow-up from today's session that the superintendent will bring, and additionally keep us on time to ensure that our conversation is focused on the interim goal measure at hand. And to my board colleagues, I may pause or stop to capture your questions if there are any questions that may need to be tabled that we would give to the interim superintendent at another time. I think I've talked enough, so let the conversation begin. I would now open up our conversation over our interim goal 2C. We will start with our current performance questions in our what, who, and why. And if we hear anything future, I'll ask you to hold that until we're ready to get to that. But normally with this board, we organically flow right into our future focus questions. So I'll now open it up to my board colleagues for your questions this evening.
On page 1, you identify, Matt, that 12 schools have met or surpassed this district goal. Can you tell us what's happening at these schools?
Yes. Interestingly enough, we have not been able to identify a strong correlation that any of these schools are actually doing something similar amongst the 12 to actually reach their results. So in terms of what they're doing well, there are some themes, but the themes are not right now universally driven by central office. So an example of that would be there are some themes emerging from these 12 where schools, particularly classroom teachers, students are setting goals, academic goals within the classroom at the 3rd grade level. And so there are some themes emerging that's going to provide a greater propensity to reach goals on this particular interim goal. So that's one thing that's happening. Other themes that are emerging amongst these 12 are you've got SEL champions and school leadership teams that are highly engaged in this work. That's not to say that schools that did not meet it don't have highly engaged leaders or SEL champions, but these 12, there is a theme amongst these 12 when you look at their participation in the trainings, the questions that they ask of our district SEL teams. These 12 seem to be the most engaged in terms of asking additional questions and being able to dissect the data as Panorama presents it.
I'll go next. Buenas tardes. The last item under what is not going well at the top of page 2 refers to the balance of time and space dedicated to SEL learning and implementation. What is not going well with this? Can you please clarify?
You bet. So our current structure up to this point, so as we've identified SEL champions over the last couple of years, the process that we've used is sort of a raise your hand if you have a passion about this work. And so there's no expectation that it's all one position. So for example, it's not all counselors. It could be an associate, it could be a teacher, it could be a counselor, it could be an instructional coach. And so we've got a diverse set of staff members that are the school-identified SEL champions, and that presents a challenge when it comes to each of those staff members being able and to participate in after-school trainings because of their various requirements. And so it's been a challenge to actually get them all in the same room at the same time for the same trainings. And so when they turn around and pivot and they take that learning from that training, there's an additional challenge based on the position and the roles that they carry in being able to have time in front of PLCs, time in front of staff to train their teachers and train their staff on the SEL components that they were just taught in. And so it's kind of twofold. It's the variance in staff members that are raising their hands, which is a great, attribute to have, but it doesn't come without challenges in terms of being available for the courses and the modules and the trainings, and then the about face of turning around and then pivoting and providing that training back to your staff. It's not been a universal construct. So it's created a system-wide challenge. It works in some schools better than others.
So I did just want to make note for the public, if you don't have it in front of you, we were not on track for this goal. And so I wanted to ask a question about the trend line, Matt, which is the table on page 1 of the report shows that we've had a downward trend since June 2020. So I'm really interested in the actionable plans that were put in place this year to improve the third grade black male SEL scores that did not prove to be effective. And really, how was this year's plan different than past years?
This year's plan included models, the modules from Castle for identified SEL champions to participate in. The challenge with that, again, has been their ability to participate consistently from building to building based on the roles that they hold. So that's new this year that we implemented to get some consistent training. It didn't result in consistent training because of the various roles that folks serve in the buildings. And again, consequently, that about face of expecting that training to be then transitioned and provided to staff is occurring at different levels and different degrees of implementation based on that individual SEL champion's ability to get in front of staff and have the time to do so. So it's kind of a twofold challenge. So what we offered up was that SEL module training for staff members specifically has been different for us because it's sort of on-demand training. And it didn't result in a systemic change. It resulted in a few buildings, 12 specifically, that were able to actually turn it around very, very quickly and transition that and implement that training with staff that you're seeing some results in.
Can I ask a question about our structure, just for my own clarity? Because you referred to central office driving change that you were kind of trying to. Do we have someone at central office that is championing this to help with timeline, or just so I can understand kind of what you're talking about?
We have a district SEL team that's made up of various roles from central office.
Okay.
And then schools have an SEL team at their building level.
The SEL champion.
A champion, but there's also other team members, but there's a specific champion that comes to the trainings.
Okay.
The other thing that we did at mid-year, there was a pivot mid-year, recognizing that the training up to this point has been about adult SEL, and making sure that our adults and then the mindset that we're pouring into them around students being able to do hard things and teachers being able to do hard things. There was a pivot in January that the training began to focus and add, in addition to adult SEL, the student component. And so that started in January of this fiscal year, and we're starting to see some of those results in some of our schools here. Again, if they were there and they had the training and they were able to pivot based on the time that they had in buildings to begin to implement and focus on student SEL. Because that has not been our plan up to this point. It has been focused on adult SEL. And the reason for that is because it's a 1.57 effect size for student academic outcomes. If adults develop a strong SEL and a belief that students can do hard things and can achieve high academic standards, it begins there. And it's now beginning to transition into students.
If I could follow up on that. So on page 1, we talked about SEL champions, and you talked about highly engaged SEL leaders in the schools. What does that look like for the student? Like, if you could just give an example, give context for what these highly engaged leaders are doing in terms of interaction either with their peers or their students.
Yeah, so that's actually, the question, if I hear you asking, is what is the SEL champion's role? Is that
Yeah, and
accurate?
after the training, after Castle, after these things, what would the outcome, how do we know that an adult is more SEL aware? Or how do you see the impacts of SEL in a student?
Yeah, so for the actual role of the SEL champion is designed to actually receive the training and then turn around and then train a trainer model, if you will. Go back to the school, work with the school leadership team, and work with the teachers on developing adult SEL in terms of, and what that might sound like is how do we talk about student achievement? How do we talk about student access to high quality curriculum instruction? Is our instructional methodology or design in the classroom, is it empowering for students? Is it engaging for students? And do we build them up to see themselves doing really hard academic work? Or do we put things in front of them and say, this is going to be difficult, do the best you got? And it's positive talk. It's all of those things that I think we would intuitively lift up around how do you build someone up to empower them to own their learning. And so that's what you would hear from teachers is talking about, no, I want that student in my class because he or she or they can do this work. They deserve to have access to high quality curriculum and instruction, and so we don't need to actually pull them out. That's what you would hear from adults in a building that have a high sense of SEL understanding. From students, you would hear similar positive talk around, I know I can do this. It might be challenging and I may not get it today, but I can get it tomorrow. And here's the goal that I'm setting in order to achieve that in this classroom. A really good example of that is as we began to tease the data out, and again, it's a really small sample size. We're talking about, in terms of the number of third grade students who identify as Black male, is about 220 students. So when you look at more than 2,000 third graders total, this is 220 students. Of those 220 students, in the third grade, students who identify as Black male are also multilingual learners. The percent of favorable responses for those students, which again is about 57 students, it's a small sample size, is 67.4%. At that rate, we've almost reached actually our target goal of 70%. And so what we would attribute that to is students being given access, kind of like we talked about in our last monitor report, access to that grade level curriculum instruction, because we're communicating to students, in this case, Black males who are multilingual learners, that you need to be in this core classroom. Because you can do it. You are fully capable and you are fully brilliant enough to actually achieve these high levels of these academic standards. And the only way that you can do that is by being in this classroom and being with your peers and being in these groups. You can do that in these classrooms. You don't need to be pulled out. You can do this hard work. And so that's where we're starting. Again, it's a small sample size, so it's really hard to draw systemic conclusions with a small sample size. But if we begin to make some of these correlations, seeing that 67.4% of the 57 students that identify as third grade Black males that are multilingual learners, there is some correlations that you can begin to at least ask more questions about systemically. Did that answer your question? I talked a lot.
No, you did. It's, what it looks like is helpful, just for context. I think the only other follow-up I'd ask, and I think because, so on page 1, you say what's not going well, you mentioned the extremely small sample size. So what strategies are being considered specifically for that student population? And is it, because it's such a small sample size, are you actually able to target specific approaches based on Black male and or other identifications?
Yeah, it's difficult at the systems level. Schools obviously know who their students are, right? So then they know who each of these students are and are working to build very specific plans of supports with individual students. At the district level, because of making a systemic sort of conclusion at 220 students, it makes it really difficult because there's such a pendulum swing in terms of the percent rates. A single student, for example, if you have 5 students, which is on average, if you take the 220 divided by the 38 elementary schools, it's about 5 students average that identify as a third grade black male student. Well, that student now represents 20%. And so one change in a favorable response could swing the entire percentage of that building 20 percentage points. And so it makes it difficult to draw a systemic conclusion. Schools obviously have a little bit more data in front of them that they're able to do some of those things with. But at the district level, which is kind of where one of the grow-tos is in terms of the next steps is, we need to look at collapsing grades 3 through 5 as part of a potential next step for us. 220 students is just not a large enough sample size.
Thank you.
On page 1, in what is going well, you identify that 10 schools with the lowest results from fall of '22 grew for spring of 2023. And what can you attribute that growth to in those particular schools?
Engagement in the data set. Each of these schools have a deeper and broader data literacy around panorama and self-efficacy, and those 5 questions that are asked as a part of that self-efficacy construct. And so when you begin to break each of those questions down individually, you're talking about 10 schools where their teams are able to dig deeply into that data. And in that, even that is somewhat limiting when you look at a systems approach. And the reason why I say that is because we have to, as an aggregate, we have to do that kind of by hand. Panorama right now doesn't allow you to break it down third grade black male student, and so we have to do that by hand. When we had Tableau, we were able to do some of those things for schools and pull that data and then disaggregate it and aggregate it for schools. Since the cyber attack, we don't have Tableau up, and so that's creating a little bit of a challenge for us. For buildings to really dig deeply into that, but they're doing as much of that as they can. And the schools that are actually growing the most are the schools that are digging deeply into that data from fall and putting in specific plans to have that be impacted in the spring. And there are some, if I may, just some schools I would just like to recognize and lift up in terms of that percentage of growth. And again, I just want to continue to lift up. It's a small sample size, and so there's going to be some large swings potentially both ways. But nonetheless, these are some schools that not only met the goal, but also had really large growth from fall to spring. Hubble Elementary School, a 32% growth. Howell Elementary School, 19%. Oak Park Elementary School, 19%. Carver Elementary School, 15%. Phillips Elementary, 15%. Wright Elementary, 13%. Morris Elementary, 12%. Hillis Elementary School, 13%. So you're talking about some schools that met the goal, but also had larger, double-digit swings of positive, favorable responses.
Okay, so on I'm looking at there's one question I'm not sure if I put it in the future, so I may save that, and then you can adjust if you need to throw it, I don't know. I'll wait on that one, but page 1, the participation rate of over 85%, where we're getting a good participation rate from students. With legislation that is talking about the opt-in approach for surveys, do we know how that may impact participation, and is there a plan in place for how we can assure that we have some data around this?
Yeah, we don't know yet how that's going to, impact the various surveys that we actually ask students and families to actually participate in. And so there's going to have to be some work done over the coming months in preparation of next school year, but it won't have a positive impact, I can tell you that. We're going to have to do our work to make sure that we're communicating why this data is important, why we're asking these questions, and how that's going to benefit students, staff, and families in terms of how we utilize the data and where we actually post the data for full transparency. I think that's a lot of questions that we get, whether it's legislatively driven or not. many parents and many students and many families just want to know, how do you utilize this data? I don't want to take a survey just to take a survey. And so it's going to be important that we're strategic in the number of surveys that we send out to students and families and staff, but also what we ask and when we ask it is going to be just as important.
If I had another question too, that, just curious, on page 1, under what is going well, you talk about black male, or third grade black males are responding favorably, slightly higher than our overall third grade student population. Do you know what may be causing that they are responding more favorably than the rest of the population, or the average of the population?
Well, I don't, actually. I just know that there's not a gap, right? Sometimes we see a gap in the achievement rates and sometimes the response rates of black male students who identify as black male as compared to their peers. And we don't see that here. We don't see it in the third grade, and we don't see it in the other grade levels either. So that's a positive.
So I had a question about the panorama participation rate on page 2 again. It says that our participation rate was 85%, but the average is 80. Is that right? National average is 80%. What do you attribute a higher than average participation rate to?
Schools aware that this is important information. We've spent the last several years talking about SEL and what it means to not only our students, but also particularly our staff, of making sure that we take care of one another and that we continue to actually positively speak about the achievements in the can-do attitude around really hard work. And I think that what you see is that paying off in terms of participation rates. As you know, there's legislation that was attempted to be passed that suggests that SEL is not important. And I think what we've continued to do is lift up that it actually is important, and having a belief in self and a belief in others and being able to vulnerably communicate that on a daily basis without shame and without blame is a really important factor in students achieving at high levels and staff knowing that they can also achieve at very high levels.
I'm going to do maybe just a follow-up, and I think it's very similar to Jackie's and maybe Kim's question. And I think you attributed the growth to engagement and maybe participation, I think is what you said. Are there, or what are other implications of the infrastructure that you have in place at every elementary school that's led to growth in more than 10% in most of our schools, besides the stipend for SEL champions and support for professional learning? That's listed on page 1 under what's going well.
Yeah, I think in terms of the structure aspect of it, which I think is what your question is the identification of someone who lifts their hand and says, I want to do this because I'm passionate about it. That in and of itself is meaningful, of someone saying that I'm really interested in SEL and I want to learn more about it, and I want to teach my colleagues about what SEL is and its impact on student outcomes and staff outcomes. That structure in and of itself is important. The structure of being able to go to training and learn more is the other one that we lifted up and talked about. There's some challenges with that in terms of the variance of positions and the time availability after school to actually engage in those trainings. But then there's also the school SEL teams. And so schools have identified beyond the SEL champion team members that have these conversations around how do we actually create a culture of improved self-efficacy for students and for staff. And so these teams are built and structured at all of our schools. And some are more effective right now in their structure than others.
Any other questions? Yeah, if we're feeling ready for future, we're about almost 30 minutes into our conversation. So if we're feeling comfortable with moving to our future focus questions, we can go into that. That does not mean that you can't take a step back if we go back into the who, what, and why, but we'll focus on future right now.
So, and I feel like you maybe have already addressed this, because on page 1, when you under what is going well, the infrastructure's in place for, SEL champions, supporting professional learning. When do you think we expect kind of that full implementation across the schools, and what are those barriers? I know you talked about like staff sometimes with the PD and their availability, but
Yeah.
what do you foresee
Some of our
as when?
plans, and this is that future-facing sort of, opportunity, I think, that you're asking about, include two specific things. Number one, we're talking, well, three, but at the building level, what we're talking about is based on what we know and what we learned about the variance of roles and positions and their availability to be in trainings, we need to offer potentially a course correction in terms of, do we need to actually identify the same position, for example, a counselor? We know there's counselors at every building, and we know what their ratio is. So that's a potential adjustment that we would end up making for next year. There's still more conversations to have around that, because there's also the potential natural assumption that all counselors have masters in mental health and understand what SEL is in general, and that's just not the case. And so we do have some of that, but we also have a variance of knowledge base even amongst our counselors. And they're all wonderful, and so these are conversations that we're having around, is that the right position to actually universally build out and to create that construct at schools so that it's consistent. The other aspect of that, which is closely related, which is the time of the day of the trainings. That was one of the challenges, was that the trainings were always after school. And again, based on the variance of roles, some folks could participate consistently and others were hit and miss. So recognizing that we actually might need to shift the training into the school day to incorporate where we know folks are already on contract and where they're going to be, and so that's an opportunity for us to actually improve the time of day of that training, which I think is going to make a difference. The other thing that's going to make a difference in terms of what's forward-facing for next year is moving more of our approach to be targeted at the student level. And so Panorama offers what they call as a playbook, and there are examples of strategies within that playbook that we are looking to actually deploy and execute on universally in all of our elementary schools next year. An example of that would be, again, goal setting. We know, again, where there's some of those themes are some of our schools that are growing the most and that are meeting the goal. That's already taken place, but it's not because we've expected it or we've trained on it and we've actually pushed that out from central office. That's what we're moving forward with next year, is actually driving that from central office. But again, utilizing our schools that are already doing it and already seeing the success from it with the same kids. So we've got success models already in play to amplify and then multiply next year with some of those similar universal strategies at the student level.
My question is around, on page 2, you mentioned those SEL champions, and how do we know the strategy is working? And you just touched on that a little bit, but how, with the sample size being so small, how do you have confidence that this particular work, these trainings, the investment, the cascading from the entire system is the strategy to go with?
A couple different ways. One is that we know it's going to be the right thing to do because we haven't universally addressed student SEL yet. It's all been the mindset and focus on adult SEL, which is not wrong. The time is now for us to actually add to that training to begin to incorporate very specific expectations universally across student SEL. So focusing on some very specific strategies and then creating monitoring structures to know that those strategies are being implemented through classroom observations. And again, we assess this in the fall, and of course we reassess with Panorama in terms of self-efficacy in the spring. So we'll have that fall data set to actually work from to know where it's happening and where it's not happening. Can you ask your question one more time? I want to make sure that I've covered it.
You have. How do we know that the strategy itself is going to work? And-
Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe I'll follow up on that as well. Because there has been a continual decline year over year, and this is on page 1, to see how much time, I think, do you give this? And what I think I heard from your answer is we're moving into monitoring. So the expectation now is that it's universally offered, trained, and next year, which would be June 2024, we're monitoring in 2024
At the student level.
at the student level?
Yes. What I'll add a little bit to that. So when we look at June 2020 at 69%, and then it falls to 62%, right, year after year, and then it goes to 59%, and this year is 56%. One of the questions, I mean, we've asked a number of questions in terms of like, what are the potential correlations to this? And examples of that are things like, what is the relationship between self-efficacy and enrollment for third grade black males? So we started to analyze that. Is there a correlation between there? And there was not a correlation. What is the relationship between self-efficacy and attendance for third grade students, or chronic absenteeism? There was no correlation. What is the relationship between self-efficacy and years of teacher experience? So we look at the third grade teachers across the board. Is there a relationship between students scoring at a higher rate of favorability in self-efficacy? And there was no correlation, a relationship between self-efficacy and student-teacher relationships. So we ask all of these questions around what are the correlations that we can find. And again, it's increasingly difficult with a small sample size because it fluctuates so much. So the reason why I'm lifting that up is one of the things that we also asked, and it's a wondering that we have. We don't have an answer to this yet, but we're working with Panorama to sort of ask the question more nationally as well as statewide, which is what is the effect of the implementation of more rigorous curriculum in EL and IM at the same grade levels having on teacher efficacy and student efficacy at the same time? Because again, efficacy is all about, as it's defined by Panorama, is how much students believe they can achieve academic outcomes. If we've implemented two different curriculums now, one for math and one for literacy, at a much higher rate of rigor, and that's standards-based, is that having a detrimental impact over the last few years that we've been implementing this in terms of efficacy? So it's a question I don't have an answer to yet, but we're exploring that. And then, of course, Panorama would suggest that nationally, I think they're getting ready to put out some national data, that student efficacy is impacted over the last several years by the pandemic. And so how does that actually manifest itself in schools and in classrooms? But it really isn't a question that we're grappling with right now, is even to the idea of teachers that are feeling more confident about their implementation of EL. Is there a correlation with students feeling a higher sense of self-efficacy about what they can do in the classroom if the teacher's more confident about what he, she, or they can do in the classroom? So, but right now that sample size is so small. So looking to maybe collapse that data to 3, 4, 5 in the coming years might give us a more systemic conclusion to draw from.
Matt, you've talked about sample size a few times of being so small and challenging to draw conclusions. What anecdotal evidence have you gathered or, have you worked on to try to draw conclusions, conversations with students, families?
All the above, talking with teachers, talking with principals, like what are you seeing when you're in classrooms? Are you seeing anything that looks like, sounds like positive self-talk, positive, classroom talk around being able to motivate and inspire students to achieve higher? So there's some of those anecdotal evidences that you would see, particularly in the schools that actually met the goal and schools that made significant growth, where their building-based goals are around how are we actually talking to children in the classroom in terms of whether their ability to meet, number one, to access high-quality curriculum, but then to meet those rigorous standards that we're putting in front of them. And you hear more of that language in those schools that are showing significant growth and that met the target, that it's more of a intentional conversation amongst that staff.
On page 1, under what is going well, it talks about engagement of SEL champions and building administrators in the Castle On Demand course. How will this ensure desired results in the data?
Can you ask your question one more time? I want to make sure I heard it.
Yes. So on page 1, under what's going well, it talks about the engagement of SEL champions and building administrators. And
Keep going. I'm listening.
if that question doesn't, that's the edited version. So I don't know if I need to go back to what I originally had shared?
I think you asked, you asked it. I just think just repeat that. Just
Okay.
repeat
All right.
the question. You asked it.
I'll start over. On page 1, under what's going well, it talks about engagement of SEL champions and building administrators in the Castle on Demand course. How will this ensure desired results in the data?
Okay, thank you. The first it does is that it calibrates that team on what SEL is, not only for adults, but what SEL is for students. And so it brings everybody under the same learning opportunity in the training to say, this is actually what the look fors and sound, what it looks like and sounds like when we go into classrooms. And so this is how we create some universal checklists of our monitoring and our execution of this plan moving forward. Because right now, what we're working with is just a variance, large variance of understanding, not only from building the building in terms of what SEL actually is and what it looks like and sounds like, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there about SEL. But it's also a variance amongst school team members. And so this is where actually moving towards more of an identified position that's going to be, number one, have the time to go to the trainings for next year, but number two, have consistent expectations from that role around the about face of how we train our own team members at the building level. We'll begin to calibrate teams around what we're looking for and what we're asking for to see executed in classrooms.
I just want to follow up on the question that Jenna asked, because you talked about different strategies that you're deploying. So this is on page 1, what's going well. You haven't mentioned community-based strategies, and so I think the example was parent. And is that by design, meaning its efficacy? You're probably thinking through all the different strategies. So what are other strategies to improve student self-efficacy that go beyond potentially just the student and the teacher?
Yeah, what we haven't done, to your point, is actually bring in the parent and the community piece to this conversation. So moving into FY24, we've already got a structure in place known as the Student or the School Advisory Committee, the SAC. And that was formed and forged out of the tragedy at East High School. As we begin, every school this year is building an SAC that's going to meet monthly. And so that is in place at all of our schools. So what we're looking to do is utilize that structure so that we are talking about SEL components and those look-fors around efficacy and what it looks like, sounds like with students and families in those SACs. So that we can begin to generate some community understanding around what this is, why it's valuable, and why it's important for not only teachers and students to have that positive self-talk about being able to achieve and do hard things and meet those high academic standards. It's important for parents and family members to also have those same conversations with students, right? So beginning to communicate that out and get their ideas on how we actually might spread this communication strategy around the positive impacts of efficacy on student outcomes.
And to be clear, I wasn't necessarily opining
Well, that's okay.
that was a good idea as much as maybe asking, does it work?
Yeah. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yep. Totally understand.
Any other questions?
What can the board do to help?
I think it's going to be even more so now, paramount for the board to continue to lift up efficacy and SEL for student staff specifically as a catalyst to achieving our academic goals and high academic outcomes for students. And I say that because the state has clearly said this is not important. And to the point where the state resources and websites have been taken down. They're no longer there. And so I think it's going to be incumbent upon our teams, the 7 of you and our district teams and our own community to lift up the fact that having a positive self-image about what you can do and what you can achieve is foundational to achieving all of the goals that we have set for our students and they've set for themselves. And I think as we continue to have that ring clear and true at this table, it sends a message to our families and to our students and our staff what we actually stand for. And I think that's going to be important because there's a lot of the state that does not stand with us on that. And everybody's entitled to their opinion. I get all that. But I can tell you that I believe that this is foundational to how we actually treat one another and how we see one another, because we know that we're expecting high results from each one of each other. So this is critical to the success of our district moving forward from my perspective.
Thank you for that. I meant to ask about budget, and I don't know if you can remind me, did we make an investment in this work anticipated for next year? So what are we going to see in the budget realm and or any other considerations we should be aware of as you are looking at these panorama results
so
and
part of-
thinking about next year?
Sure. So there's budget earmarked for additional trainings, making sure that we know who's actually going to be there and carving out that time for that. But also the potential of reinstating the district level SEL coordinator position. What we're talking about is whether or not one's enough, to be honest with you. And so there's budget earmarked for that moving forward for FY24. Thank you.
Like I have to just look around the table just to make sure I'm not jumping in and we're good. I think that concludes our monitoring conversation. Madam Chair, I would turn everything back over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's engagement in the monitoring process as we work to get better. I know all the board members have received coaching on this work and in an effort and a focus on continuous improvement. So I appreciate you all engaging in that. I will now move forward with taking action on the monitoring report, and I'll ask Interim Superintendent Smith, would you please introduce the matter?
I recommend the board receive and approve the monitoring report as providing evidence of compliance with a reasonable interpretation of goal number 2.
May I have a motion and a second to approve item C1?
Sawyer, so move.
Alonso, second.
Is there any discussion, or does anyone have any questions? Hearing none, board members, please take your vote. Cast your vote. Motion passes 6-0. We will now move to the consent agenda. Agenda. As a reminder to the board and public, the board will not engage in discussion or deliberation with a speaker regarding comments made to the agenda items. Discussion and deliberation will remain among board members at the board table with speakers' comments informing the board's discussion, deliberation, and determinations as deemed necessary. Ms. Rios, do we have any speakers?
No, we do not.
Ms. Knox, I believe you have the consent motion.
I do. I move that the board approve the consent items in accordance with recommended action for each item on the consent agenda, including bills previously authorized, certified, and approved for payment by the board secretary in the amount of $4,979,437.86, and procurement transactions in the amount of $686,330.96.
May I have a second?
Nora, second.
Is there any discussion, or does anyone have any questions? Hearing none, board members, please cast your votes. Motion carries 6-0. Now we have our information-only items. Item E1, the board time use evaluation. Item E2 is an updated conflict of interest disclosure statement, and item E3, Head Start Committee minutes from March 2023. Next on the agenda, we have items of privilege. I would like to ask if any of our board members would like to share anything.
Yeah, I would just say, with it being National Teacher Appreciation Day, thank you to all of our teachers in the district. And yeah, and I think yesterday was principals. Am I correct? So thank you to our teaching staff and our leadership staff. Appreciate you.
Kim and I had the chance to celebrate the seniors and all of the students who participate in the culinary program here at Central. And we should all just be so proud.
Chef's kiss.
Yes, it was, the food was phenomenal, but the young people and how they showed up and how their 2 instructors showed up, we should all be really proud and grateful. So yeah, it was wonderful. I wish everybody could see that.
Just what Kelly said. Thank you to our teachers, our teaching staff. Thank you for all that you do.
To add on to Central happenings, the fashion show is happening this weekend. So I wanted to give a shout out for that to come and support students. And I also wanted to just put in a plug for our high school juniors or parents of juniors that may be watching, that Drake University is having a Civic Leadership Academy this summer, and they're taking applications that are due at the end of the week. And what a wonderful place to have representation from DMPS, but learning about civility and being a wonderful civic leader. We need more. Anyone doing the Hoover shout out? Go ahead. And shout out to our Hoover track girls, right, for showing up at Drake Relays. So a lot to be proud of here in DMPS.
And I would just like to remind everyone that East High School will be naming their court, Sam Powell Court. That will be on Saturday at 1 p.m. So I hope you can come out to be a part of that celebration. Maybe Matt was going to mention it too. I feel like some of the things we say we're probably taking away from you, Matt, but just wanted to invite you all to be a part of that.
We'll also honor King Elementary School in their 50th anniversary that is happening tomorrow evening. So again, today is not Wednesday. Thursday evening, yes. If there's not anything else, I'll turn it over to Interim Superintendent Smith for the superintendent's report.
Yeah, I've got quite a bit, and you actually did hit many of it. So, but I've still got a lot more. So, in the spirit of our marketing campaign, "Come Here, Become a Champion Here," we had many talented students participate in the Drake Relays, and we are so proud of each and every one of them. We got some special shout-outs, though. The girls' Hoover High School 4x100 relay team made up of Takira Smith, Monet Kine, Kim Karnga, and sister Jessica Kine took first place. The girls, yes, absolutely. Come Here, Become a Champion Here also applies to the girls' mile from Roosevelt High School. First place, Adrienne Butner Cable won the mile. There you go. Adrienne showed up yet again for the 800. She came here and also became a champion in the 800, receiving first place. Adrienne Butner Cable again from Roosevelt in the 800. And then the girls' 200-meter, Jessica Kine, Hoover High School, placed second place, also a champion. There she goes. The Rotary Club of Des Moines honored 5 DMPS teachers as Teachers of the Year this past week. Lynn Anlauer from Coles Montessori, Sarah Flores from Morris Elementary, Ruby Herrera from Roosevelt High School, Natalie Niemeyer Lorenz from East High School, and Angela Leeper, Brubaker Elementary School. Come Here, Become an Amazing Teacher Here. Applies to that one. Yeah. And the Rotary Club also gave out $8,000 scholarships to 6 of our outstanding students. Christina Hernandez from East High School, Daniela Pintor Mendoza from Hoover High School, Maria Santos Gomez from Lincoln High School, Genesis Duarte Perez from North High School, Lucy Swager from Virtual Campus High School, and Lauren Hall from Roosevelt High School, all Rotarian recipients of an $8,000 scholarship. Come Here, Become a scholarship winner. And also, Des Moines Public Schools is unique among Iowa school districts for having meaningful partnerships with all 3 of our state great public universities. Those relationships are growing again thanks to a new partnership with the University of Northern Iowa and the launch of our Purple Pathway, a program to support the education and growth of school administrators here in DMPS. And our Talent Personnel Office is doing some amazing work. The University of Iowa has named Des Moines Public Schools one of this year's recipients of their Career Impact Award as a highly engaged employer. The honor recognizes our work to support Iowa students and graduates, including internship and career opportunities. A special congratulations goes out to Theron Hobbs, Jr., our Recruitment and Retention Coordinator, for leading the district's work with the University of Iowa. Thank you, Theron Hobbs.
So much to celebrate. Thank you for that report, and thank you for joining us, everyone, this evening. We greatly appreciate you all. And this meeting is adjourned at 6:25 PM.